And we'll move on. We have another Adriatic presentation, this time by Wolfgang Göderle from the University of Graz. And Wolfgang will be speaking about the bureaucracy in the late Habsburg Empire, the vipers, the mongooses of Meleda. Wolfgang, take it away.
Hi, good evening. Thank you very much, Rock. Unfortunately, I was unable to unmute myself, so it took me a second. One might think I'm almost a digital native, but I'm not. Okay, good evening, everybody. Good morning and good afternoon. I would like to thank the organizers. Unlike Dasha, I am able to do that. Thank you very much for the invitation. I was very happy to come to speak to you here. And I do hope that we will soon be able to meet in person again, as the online meetings just start feeling weirder and weirder. And this is really a weird time also, a Saturday evening for a presentation. Just a few remarks from my side in the beginning. I was giving the title of my presentation a lot of thought when I wrote my abstract back in November. And as you can see here, there is neither mention of civil servants nor of civil service. And quite a couple of the presentations I heard so far made me think, where can we draw the line between civil service and military in the Habsburg Empire? I spent some considerable amount of time counting and measuring the size of the body of the Habsburg civil service, a terrible task, as John Dieck will surely confirm. Yet I argue that there is no clear line for a number of reasons. First, the Habsburg civil service wore uniforms very similar to those used by the military. I will provide you with the abundance of exceptions a little later, but we could see that very well in the presentation of Peter and Jana yesterday. Then the militarily organized gendarmerie clearly belonged to the civil service. And those who have to crunch the numbers tend to add some 300,000 military to the total number of civil servants in 1910. To cut this down here and to come to my actual presentation, I chose bureaucracy, an equally impaired term, over civil service, and I used to be quite happy with that choice. Yet now there are two observations maybe some of you share. One is that everything was way more about service than about civil in the Habsburg Empire. And the second thing, however, is, and that is one main argument that I would like to present. Just 1 second. Unlike in the empires in the days of yore, the civil service had become part of society in middle-class empires such as the Habsburg Empire around 1900. And here are the numbers that are supposed to prove that point. Out of a total population of 28.4 million in Cisleithania in 1910, the professional census gives a number of 900,000 in the public service, plus another 300,000 in the military. If we try to include the families and the employees of those in the public service, we end up at a number that is somewhere between 3 and 4 times as high of persons that were directly or indirectly involved with the running of the empire. Therefore, I suggest to assume that roughly 15% of the empire's population were directly or indirectly involved with its administration and upkeep. Civil servants, I further argue, bureaucrats, soldiers, diplomats, and officers not only served the emperor, they also participated actively in the imperial project. Even if we consider the late, I'm sorry, I can't read my own handwriting. Even if we argue this was a middle-class empire, by far not every civil servant was a member of the middle classes. A considerable number of Amtsdiener, in English ushers, were rather working class. The standard employee was most probably not a full-time employee, but someone who was running other businesses as well, particularly on the local level. Civil servants were working as day laborers, and a large number started their career as Praktikanten, thus as unpaid interns. On the other hand, of the social range. A considerable number of aristocrats was still serving the emperor in the diplomatic service and in the army, yet also in a large number of high-ranking, though not always well-paying jobs at the top of its hierarchy. The Habsburg civil service featured a huge number of different phases and jobs by the early 20th century. It had somehow become a mirror of the society. The example that I would like to present you today is as colorful, entangled, and complicated as possible. It explores the constraints and agencies of mainly middle-class civil servants in the last decades of the empire and shows the degree to which imperial administration had extended its mandate by the beginning of the 20th century. I will present to you civil servants, oh, 1 second, that was too early. I will present to you civil servants on 3 different levels of administration, working in the realms of 4 different ministries and trying to make the non-human work in the imperial interest, another line of continuity to what Dasha has already told us. So there is something more connecting our 2 presentations, as I found out very delighted earlier, but just the neighborhood of the Adriatic. Finally, I will come to some conclusions I would like to share with you, and I would very much appreciate to hear your opinion on. This case of vipers and mongooses raises a huge number of interesting questions, starting with the almost classic question of a center and periphery, continuing with a current discussion of the Anthropocene. It delves into Habsburg colonialism and Orientalism, and it is a matter of environmental history, or rather the large and increasingly important field of environmental humanities. Due to the tight schedule, I'm not going any deeper into any of these questions, yet I'm willing to discuss this and to have your ideas on that. So feel free to get in touch with me in case you would like to. A final warning, the next slide is going to be very graphic, so in case you are sensitive, I suggest to minimize the screen so you don't get scared. I move on. Just a few short remarks on the notorious mongooses and vipers that are supposed to be in the center of my presentation, but unfortunately are not, as the civil servants and the bureaucrats are. My entire study evolves around a seemingly unusual operation, the import and release of 10 Indian mongooses between 1909 and 1910 in then Habsburg Dalmatia. The animals were bought by an official of the Ministry of Trade and Commerce in Bombay, who took care they were sent to Trieste in the following spring of 1910 to be released on the island of Meleda, which was supposedly the stage of a snake plague that effectively kept the island from living up to its full economic potential. The dangerous snakes were horned vipers, Vipera ammoditis. They lived across larger parts of the southeastern periphery of Habsburg Central Europe and had become an important actor in imperial politics, at least on the regional level, soon after 1900. Bourgeois and aristocratic dandies made them an important subject of their talks. Peasants turned into businessmen and bounty hunters and started breeding them. The vipers themselves developed a range of appropriate strategies to keep a low profile and move on with their lives in a traditional way, when this became more and more impossible. Before long, they became the target of a smear campaign that blamed them for preventing the installation of a Naturpark, a nature park, on the remote island of Meleda, off the Dalmatian coast. Mongooses recruited by force were brought in to deal with the situation, and this is where the trouble began. The Habsburg Empire and its civil servants and officials did not omit a single opportunity to underline this was a civilized place, and everybody, troubleshooting mongooses included, had to undergo an administrative protocol. The mongooses thus found themselves in the claws of a bureaucratic apparatus. Their respective experience was nothing short of a tour de force through everything administration had to offer, from finding out who was actually in charge of them to spending quarantine in a not entirely satisfactory environment to finally being resettled to a place that has way less to offer than has originally been promised. The Mongoose operation appears to have been launched by one single person, a relatively high-ranking civil servant, Sektionschef Riedel, spontaneously on the occasion of a business trip to India in either 1908 or 1909. In his function, Riedel was concerned with the economic development of Dalmatia. Dalmatia was the economically weakest province of the dual monarchy. It fared way worse than the poorest areas of Hungary and had seen considerable political unrest in the second half of the 19th century. Its scarce population had a tendency to emigrate. It was extremely heterogeneous, and its attitude toward the imperial rule in Vienna could have been better, to phrase that politely. Riedel was a renowned specialist for Dalmatia and its situation. The project for economical development went beyond the civil service and its employees. Different bourgeois groups in Vienna had taken an interest in the Adriatic coast and pursued personal and economic interests that were closely entangled with what the empire could do in terms of creating investment opportunities. Neither of the two sides, the empire and its bourgeois citizens, had any money to spare. Riedel and many other experts were well aware that a railway link could lead to some development. Beside the horrific costs of such a project, however, strategic perspectives had to be taken into account. Among the very few relatively low threshold actions that could be taken were the snakes that prevented a better touristic exploitation of larger parts of Dalmatia, particularly Meleda. Riedel purchased the Mongooses, probably spontaneously, and arranged for the animals' transfer to Korčula. Yet, as an executive of the Ministry of Trade, there was little more he could do. Back in Vienna, he contacted the Ministry of Agriculture, in charge of the state forest on Meleda, and requested them to take charge of the further operation. Little is known about the acting civil servants in the Ministry of Agriculture. They remain invisible for us. However, not only did they take charge of the Mongooses, they also decided swiftly that these would need acclimatization and a proper diet, and they consulted the second Oberforstrat in this conference, Mr. Karl Schwutek of Göderle. The first Oberforstrat, of course, was Franz Wondrak, yesterday presented by Peter Beck and Jana Osterkamp. Göderle was probably not the most exciting place for any Habsburg career executive to end up. Yet since the late 19th century, it hosted one out of only a handful of Forst- and Domänendirektionen of Cisleithania. These administrated and exploited the huge imperial forests, yet they were also in charge of a number of further related issues that were not written down in any Dienstpragmatik, for instance, Mongooses. Mr. Schwutek was an experienced and well-learned Bohemian with almost 40 years of service when he received a message from the ministry, yet he obviously had never had anything to do with Mongooses, as he had to go into his library and look them up in Brehm's Tierleben, which proved quite a common move among the bureaucrats involved with this operation. What he knew immediately was that he could not send the animals directly to Meleda, where there was hardly any infrastructure, no food, and only a couple of auxiliary foresters. He replied to Vienna that he suggested a change of plans by sending the animals to Kurzola first at Korčula, where District Forester Forstrat Karl Schwutek could take care of the situation. Vienna reluctantly agreed to the proposed changes, and Mr. Schwutek received a letter which initiated him to take a look at Brehm's Tierleben before starting construction for a mongoose house on a piece of land next to his public office building. Next, the Admiralty at Trieste, which is the picture that you can see here, got involved in charge of the redirection of the Mongooses to Korčula, where they arrived in mid-July 1910, almost 3 months after Mr. Schwutek in Göderle had received the first message. I would add something on the routing of Habsburg bureaucrats in local associations and clubs in order to make the link to what Daja has told us a little bit earlier, but I feel that I'm a little bit tight on schedule, so I will move on. We can talk about that in the discussion. Much to his surprise, Karl Schwutek found out one Friday night in midsummer that he had to take care of 12 instead of 10 mongooses, and much to the surprise of a dozen officials from 2 ministries and the imperial menagerie, the mongooses' diet differed considerably from what Mr. Brehm had suggested. Even though the detailed instructions handed out by the Ministry of Agriculture in Vienna had been altered prior to the arrival of the Mongooses, a short quarantine instead of a long acclimatization was now on the program. No mongoose house, instead the inner yard of Mr. Niedli's public office building. The Habsburg Public Service at Göderle presented itself well prepared for the challenge. Beside Mr. Niedli, another Bohemian with a personal history with Croatia, at least 3 local auxiliary foresters were ready to look after the mongooses, and the district veterinarian, Dr. Michael Renchevich, was looking forward to learning something new. Reading from the reports, the Mongooses spoiled the Dalmatian summer for most civil servants involved. They arrived alive and lively, though in poor condition due to terrible travel conditions, which earned them a lot of sympathy. Things soon changed when the mongooses refused to eat what Mr. Brehm had suggested to serve them. When they developed diarrhea, the working conditions for Mr. Niedli went downhill rapidly. He arranged for the cages to be cleaned more often, 3 times a day, and started a tiresome inquiry into what the mongooses could actually like to eat. The animals further did not appreciate Dr. Renchevich's efforts to assess the health condition. One of the mongooses managed to escape. Mr. Niedli decided to take action, and he managed to get the authorization to release the animals even sooner than expected on the neighboring island of Meleda. Unfortunately, the swift communications inside the Habsburg administration were inhibited by the summer months. Vienna responded more slowly than usual, and one has to keep in mind that Niedli could not contact Vienna directly, but he had to go via Görz. He asked whether he could get a ride on one of the steamers of the Ministry of Finance stationed in Sara, the so-called Finanzdampfer. He further requested assistance by the Ministry of Interior. As the date of the release, 26 August 1910, came closer and no replies came from Vienna, Mr. Niedli showed some initiative of his own and arranged for the transport of the mongooses on the Finanzdampfer im kurzen Dienstweg, thus informally, by simply speaking to his colleague from the finance administration, who certainly agreed. The mongooses were successfully released on Meleda in the morning of August 26, 1910, yet Mr. Niedli was admonished for using the Finanzdampfer without prior authorization from Vienna a few months later. Whether the mongooses proved efficient against the vipers is difficult to assess, but that is a whole other story. There are a few things to learn from the mongoose operation. First, it primarily took place in relatively young fields of administration. The Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Trade and Commerce were all authorities that came into life in the 19th century in order to respond to new areas opening up to imperial responsibility. Second, the conditions under which the middle-class civil servants I presented worked were very different from those of the men involved with the oldest parts of the Habsburg administration, which was at the same time closest to the emperor, whereas diplomats and cavalry officers had to ensure that they had the financial means to properly represent the empire and the emperor. Neither Mr. Riedel nor Mr. Schwutek nor Mr. Niedli disposed of the personal means to do so. Their Dienstpragmatik, however, provided them with service apartments and small financial means to keep an appropriate household. I suggest to rethink Habsburg civil service in a differentiated way, capable of dealing with the different layers and genealogies of its different offices and ministries. There was an innermost ring of ministries that go back into the Ancien regime. The Ministry of War as well as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for instance. These offices lay closest to the emperor himself, and access to important positions there remained limited to a small circle of persons who disposed of certain requirements. The second ring of ministries consisted of agencies that had gained importance in the course of the imperial modernization in the mid-19th century. For instance, the Ministry of Interior, yet also the Ministry of Finance, frequently older institutions that had grown considerably as their areas of activity had expanded enormously. These were ministries that were in charge with a territorial administration and the provision of basic administrative services to individual citizens and subjects, respectively subjects. They required large numbers of well-qualified employees, and the conditions of employment had been adapted soon. Service apartments and household allowances including. The third ring of ministries finally saw the newest creations, such as the Ministry of Trade, the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Public Buildings, the Ministry of Railways, etc. It is particularly in these ministries that were further given less priority from a central imperial perspective that a lot of negotiation between the empire and its society took place. The case of the Mongooses shows very well how talented officials like Riedel could exploit certain liberties and successfully start initiatives on their own. It also shows how eagerly the hierarchy reacted in terms of discipline and adherence to proper channel, thus the Einhaltung des Dienstweges. Whereas communication inside one ministry was extremely quick and efficient, it appears to have been tiresome and slow across resource. I think I will end here. I could add some more lines of conclusion, but this would consume our time for discussion. So I would just like to finish here and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Wolfgang, for this fascinating paper.